The Capricorn Stellium. Who owns the land? Every 32 years, America asks the same question. We've never answered it. In January 2026, 4 planets converge in Capricorn: the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. This rare alignment, a stellium, occurs when multiple planets occupy the same sign simultaneously, concentrating their energies into a single archetypal domain. Capricorn is the cardinal Earth sign, ruled by Saturn. It governs structure, authority, government, responsibility, time, and, crucially, land. The mountain, the foundation, what endures, what we build, what we own. This stellium has occurred 5 times in the past 160 years: 1866, 1898, 1930, 1962, and 1994. Each time, America faced a crisis of land, property, and governmental authority. Each time, the nation asked the same question: who owns the land? Who does the government protect? What structures are failing? And what will replace them? In January 2026, we ask again. The stellium window. The sun transits Capricorn from December 21st, the winter solstice, through January 19th. But the full stellium, all 4 planets aligned, occurs only during a narrow window, January 1st to the 17th. The first 17 days of 2026 carry the full weight of this alignment. What surfaces during this window will echo for decades. 1866, the broken promise. The Civil War had ended. 4 million people emerged from slavery. And for a brief moment, the federal government made a promise: land. General William Sherman's Field Order No. 15, issued January 1865, set aside 400,000 acres along the Atlantic coast for freed families, plots of up to 40 acres each. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to distribute confiscated and abandoned Confederate land. By June 1865, some 40,000 freed people had settled on what they called Sherman's land. Then came the betrayal. In October 1865, President Andrew Johnson ordered the land returned to its former Confederate owners. General Oliver Howard, head of the Freedmen's Bureau, was given the task of traveling to the Sea Islands to tell the freed people that the promise would not be honored. 2,000 gathered at a church on Edisto Island to hear the news. Days later, a committee of 3 freedmen, Henry Bram, Ishmael Moultrie, and Yates Sampson, wrote a letter to General Howard that survives in the National Archives. Quote, "You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island. You've only lost your right arm in war and might forgive them. The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, and who will not let me stay in his empty hut, except I will do his planting and be satisfied with his price, and who combines with others to keep away land from me, well knowing I would not have anything to do with him if I had land of my own. That man I cannot well forgive." End quote. By January 1866, the crisis had reached Congress. Senator Lyman Trumbull introduced a bill to extend the Freedmen's Bureau on January 5th. The central question consuming the nation: who has the right to own land in America? The Southern Homestead Act, passed in June 1866, opened 46 million acres to black homesteaders. But there was a catch. Freed people could claim land only until January 1st, 1867, after which former Confederates could file claims too. Meanwhile, black codes swept across the South, explicitly preventing freed people from owning or leasing land. The promise of 40 acres and a mule died in a January of Capricorn stellium. 1898, the birth of an empire. On January 25, 1898, the USS Maine entered Havana Harbor. 3 weeks later, the ship exploded. 266 sailors died. The cause remains disputed. Likely an accidental boiler explosion, but the newspapers had already decided. "Remember the Maine" became the rallying cry for war. By April, the United States had declared war on Spain. By August, it was over. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba became a de facto American proctorate through the Platt Amendment, which was written into the Cuban Constitution itself. For the first time in its history, the United States became an overseas imperial power, holding territories it had no intention of incorporating as states, governing populations it had no intention of granting citizenship. The Anti-Imperialist League formed in opposition. Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, and the former President Grover Cleveland argued that empire building violated the nation's founding principles. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana disagreed. Quote, "God has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world." End quote. The constitutional question was stark. Can the government hold territory without representation? Can it claim land without granting rights to those who live there? The answer, it turned out, was yes. 1930, the collapse. By January 1930, the Great Depression was no longer deniable. The stock market had crashed in October 1929, but the deeper crisis was in real estate. The housing boom of the 1920s had created a speculative bubble. Mortgages at the time required 50% down payments and were due in full after just 5 to 10 years. When the economy contracted, borrowers couldn't refinance. Banks failed. Farms foreclosed. Families lost everything. President Herbert Hoover, often remembered as passive, actually expanded federal power more than any peacetime president before him. Federal spending increased 48% during his term. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to bail out banks. He convened the President's Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership in 1931, the first major federal acknowledgement that housing was a government concern. But it wasn't enough. By 1932, approximately 273,000 families had lost their homes to foreclosure. Rural banks collapsed as farmers defaulted. 505 banks failed between 1921 and 1930 alone. The home ownership rate, which had climbed through the 1920s, would fall to 44% by 1940. The crisis forced a question the nation never seriously confronted. What is the government's responsibility when citizens lose their homes? 1962, the confrontation. For 3 decades, the federal government had been in the housing business. And for 3 decades, it had used that power to enforce segregation. The FHA's underwriting manual explicitly warned against inharmonious racial groups. Redlining maps, created by the Home Owners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, had marked black neighborhoods as hazardous investments. Public housing projects were deliberately cited to concentrate poverty and maintain racial boundaries. The suburban dream, funded by federal mortgages built on federal highways, was a white dream by design. By 1962, the hypocrisy had become untenable. President John F. Kennedy had campaigned in 1960 promising to end housing discrimination, quote, with the stroke of a pen, end quote. Civil rights leaders reminded him of the promise by mailing pens to the White House. Kennedy delayed for 2 years, wary of alienating Southern Democrats. On November 20th, 1962, Kennedy finally signed Executive Order 11063, Equal Opportunity in Housing. It banned discrimination in federally funded housing programs. It was the first major federal acknowledgement that the government had been complicit in housing segregation. The order was limited. It applied only to future federal housing, not existing stock. It had no enforcement mechanism, but it established a principle. The government that builds housing bears responsibility for who can access it. 1994, the ground breaks. At 4:31 a.m. on January 17, 1994, the earth moved. The Northridge earthquake struck the San Fernando Valley with a magnitude of 6.7. 57 people died. 9,000 were injured. 125,000 were left homeless. Property damage reached $50 billion, the costliest natural disaster in American history at that time. The earthquake exposed a terrifying truth. The structures we trusted were not as solid as we believed. Steel moment-resisting frames, considered the gold standard for earthquake safety, failed catastrophically. Freeway overpasses collapsed. The ground itself had betrayed the buildings standing on it. A previously unknown fault had ruptured beneath the city. 16 days earlier, on January 1st, 1994, NAFTA had taken effect. The North American Free Trade Agreement eliminated most tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It created the world's largest free trade zone. It restructured land use, labor markets, and economic relationships across the continent. On the same day NAFTA took effect, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation rose in Chiapas, Mexico. Indigenous communities declared war on the Mexican government, calling NAFTA a death sentence to their land rights. The uprising was timed to the minute. Meanwhile, the Clinton administration was launching its national home ownership strategy, designed to push home ownership rates to record highs. Lending standards were loosened. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were pressured to increase affordable housing purchases. The pattern. 5 Capricorn stelliums, 5 crises of land, property, and governmental authority. The same questions asked again and again. Who owns the land? 1866, freed people promised land, then denied it. 1898, territories claimed without citizenship. 1930, families foreclosed, homes lost. 1962, Black Americans denied access to federally funded housing. 1994, indigenous land rights challenged, ground itself unstable. What is the government's responsibility? 1866, to redistribute land or to protect existing owners. 1898, to expand or honor founding principles. 1930, to intervene in markets or let them correct. 1962, to enforce equality or defer to local discrimination. 1994, to promote ownership or regulate risk. What structures are failing? 1866, the promise of Reconstruction. 1898, the boundary between republic and empire. 1930, the private mortgage system. 1962, the legitimacy of segregated federal policy. 1994, the physical and financial ground beneath us. What long-term consequences are being seeded? Every stellium plants seeds that bloom decades later. The promise broken of 1866 shaped the inequity that 1962 tried to address. The imperial expansion of 1898 created entanglements we still navigate. The housing structures built after 1930 enabled both the suburban boom and the discriminatory redlining that followed. The loose lending of 1994 collapsed in 2008. What do we do in January 2026 that will shape 2058? 2026, the reckoning. The housing affordability crisis is no longer a regional problem. It is national. Mortgage payments have increased 82% in 5 years, while wages have risen only 26%. The gap between income and home prices has become a chasm. Multiple forecasters have dubbed 2026 the Great Housing Reset. Not a crash, a grinding, years-long correction. For the first time since the Great Recession, income growth is expected to outpace home price growth. Mortgage rates may fall to the low 6% range, but 80% of current homeowners hold rates below that. They cannot afford to move. Inventory remains 12% below pre-pandemic levels. The market is frozen. Multi-generational living is increasing. 6% of adults moved back with parents in 2025. Chosen configurations, roommates, extended family, cooperative arrangements are replacing the nuclear family home as the default aspiration. Policy responses are emerging. Bipartisan support of YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, legislation. Proposals for a national housing emergency declaration. Zoning reform. ADU expansion. The fundamental question: will the government intervene to make housing accessible or protect the asset values of those who already own? We have been here before. In 1866, the government chose existing property owners over freed people seeking land. In 1898, the government chose expansion over constitutional consistency. In 1930, the government built structures that would define housing for a century, some enabling access, others encoding discrimination. In 1962, the government acknowledged its complicity in segregation, incompletely, insufficiently, but decisively. In 1994, the government chose to promote ownership at any cost, and we paid that cost in 2008. What will we choose in 2026? The questions. The Capricorn stellium does not cause crisis. It reveals them. It illuminates what structures are failing, what foundations are cracked, what responsibilities have been deferred. As the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars converge in Capricorn this January, ask yourself, what am I building? And on what foundation? Capricorn demands that we examine the structures of our lives, not just physical structures, but the systems we depend on, the institutions we trust, the assumptions we've inherited. Are they sound? Are they just? Will they hold? What authority am I granting, and to whom? Saturn rules Capricorn. Saturn is the father, the boss, the government, the rule of law. The stellium asks, who holds authority in your life? Is that authority legitimate? Is it earned? Is it serving the greater good? Or only its own perpetuation? What responsibility am I avoiding? Capricorn is accountability. It is the recognition that actions have consequences, that choices compound over time, that the structures we build or fail to build will shape generations we will never meet. What responsibility have you been deferring? What weight have you been unwilling to carry? Who is being left out of the structure I benefit from? This is the shadow question of every Capricorn stellium. The land that freed people were denied, the territories held without representation, the neighborhoods redlined out of opportunity, the indigenous communities displaced, the families priced out. Every structure includes some and excludes others. Who is outside the walls of the structure you inhabit? What am I willing to build, even if I won't live to see it completed? Capricorn is time. Saturn is the long arc. The structures built in crisis moments endure for decades. The FHA, created in 1934, still shapes who can buy a home. The choices made in 2026 will matter in 2058, in 2090. In centuries we cannot imagine. What are you willing to build that slowly? What foundation are you willing to lay, knowing you may never see the walls rise? The inheritance. We did not choose to live through a Capricorn stellium. We did not choose to inherit the unfinished business of 1866, 1898, 1930, 1962, and 1994. But inheritance is a Capricorn word. We receive the structures our ancestors built, their gifts and their failures, their wisdom and their blind spots. The question is not whether we will be shaped by this inheritance. We already are. The question is, what will we pass on? 160 years of asking who owns the land. 160 years of asking what the government owes its people. 160 years of building structures that include some and exclude others. In January 2026, we ask again. This time, how will we answer? What structures in your life are you examining? What responsibilities are you ready to accept? What do you hope to build that will outlast you? Share your reflections. Your willingness to face the weight of Capricorn might help someone else shoulder theirs.